Chris Cook on the line. Chris, are you there?
I can hear you just about very faintly, Rory.
Now, not that these youngsters on the panel would understand, but us two having children, we all know that things can get a little bit difficult at times. So I gather you've been in the car, have you, sorting things out?
Yeah, I have been ferrying people to birthday parties this morning, but that's all behind me, and now the leisurely part of the day starts.
Are you on your way to Ascot, Chris?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Right, well, I just want to look back at some of the stories of the week. Looking back to last weekend, first of all. Now, I read your piece in The Observer, which I found quite interesting because it was talking about Tifa 2's runaway success in the Lanzarote hurdle. And you mentioned that Tifa 2 was trained by Jane Williams and not Nick Williams. Now, I think some people will know, it's fairly well known that the horses in those colours and the horses ridden by Lizzie Kelly are actually trained by Jane Williams. But if she's not a licensed trainer, there's a little bit of a discrepancy there, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, the name on the license, the name on the race card is Nick Williams. Yeah, you can say it's fairly well known that those horses that carry the sort of the orange colours, Aubusson and Tifa 2 and a few others, are in fact trained by Jane. But I mean, that's something that's, even in the press room, knowledge of that has sort of spread gradually over the last few years. Then, about a week or two ago, it was announced that Jane Williams is actually applying for a licence to train in her own name. For whatever reason, the Williamses have decided to sort of clarify their training arrangements, but it appears that there are two separate yards that they're placed down at George Nympton in Devon, and essentially two separate training operations. So I think it's all to the good that they've decided to clarify that by making clear, who's looking after which horse.
Didn't Brendan Powell and Graham Bradley get into a bit of trouble for something similar not so long ago?
Well, it depends what you mean by trouble. There was certainly a BHA disciplinary hearing, although in the end, neither of them was found to have breached any rules. There was no punishment of any kind. You have very different situations there. I mean, in Graham Bradley, you're talking about somebody who probably knows perfectly well he might have a hard time getting a trainer's license in his own name, and if he's working in any yard as a de facto trainer, the BHA are going to want to take an interest in that. In the end, they decided that he wasn't operating on that basis. It's a question of degree. Clearly, the BHA has to take an interest in, the identity of trainers, and if it appears that there is within any single training yard somebody else who's operating a different training regime, themselves without declaring it, then that potentially is a breach of the rules. From a punter's perspective as well, obviously, this is clearly of huge interest to us. You get to know how a stable operates over a period of time, don't you? I mean, that's the whole point of sort of following a particular trainer. You sort of identify opportunities when the horses are quite likely to win, and others when they don't perform so well. And if you've basically suddenly got a second stable operating within that first stable, operating in a different way, clearly that's going to throw you as a punter. It's no use at all. You need it to be clear who's really running the show. But I mean, in the case of the Williamses, it's not really clear to me that they've been doing anything in the least bit untoward. It seems that the Williamses have, I think you could say that they operate along similar lines as trainers. Nevertheless, it must be to the good. If they've got two different stables, that they clarify their arrangements by making it clear who trains which horse. People will remember when Rock and Ruby won the Champion Hurdle. Of course, he was based at a satellite yard from Paul Nicholls' main yard, and Harry Fry was running that satellite yard, and then of course, after he won the Champion Hurdle, eventually Harry Fry became sort of licensed trainer looking after Rock on Ruby and several other horses, and that was clarified. There is always a question of degree. I mean, some of the bigger trainers in the flat who've got 200 horse strings, they can't be looking after every horse themselves, and they have various different yards which are run by trusted employees. Absolutely.
Moving on to another big story in the week. A word that, well, an element, a chemistry from the periodic table, which won't have been too familiar to horse racing viewers, cobalt. has reared its head in Australia. And but you did a story about the BHA response, which was very quick.
Yes, I mean, Cobalt, I think, has taken a lot of people who follow British racing anyway by surprise. It's not something that we're familiar with talking about as a substance that can improve performance, but apparently it can have a very dramatic effect on a horse. I mean, cobalt's a naturally occurring substance. You would find it at a very low level in any horse. But if you actually treat the horse with a substance they call cobalt chloride, I think, you can inject it, or there are various other ways of getting it into a horse's system. It has a sort of effect similar to the EPO, the blood boosting that we've heard lots about over the years. It promotes production of red blood cells. It promotes a horse's endurance. And you can find quotes online from attributed to unnamed licensed professionals in Australia saying, it makes a horse go around the track like a Learjet. Other people are quoted as saying, it has a significant improving effect in the short term, but then in the long term, you find that the horse's performance declines pretty rapidly. Anyway, so, performance enhancing substance, something that's got to be of great concern. And it seems that as recently as 3 years ago, it wasn't on anybody's radar. Nobody suspected that this was being used. But at the end of 2013, the Australian harness racing, the trotting racing authorities, banned it and started testing for it. And the spring of last year, the Australian flat racing authorities started banning it too, and the California ruling body took an interest in it from summer. I must admit, when these stories came up about the positive tests in Australia, I was concerned that perhaps the BHA wouldn't be aware of it at all. But it seems that at the end of last year, it crossed their radar, the radar of their integrity services, and they conducted a test of what they describe as a significant number of horses in Britain to see, if they could find this stuff. They reckon, they're confident that their tests would turn cobalt up at an enhanced level if it was there to be found. But they didn't find any evidence of it in British racehorses. And on that basis, their press office is saying they don't think it's a problem in this country. But the details of the tests that they ran are fairly secretive. I think as a follower of racing, you'd certainly want to retain your concern. You couldn't be completely satisfied on the limited basis of what's been released so far by the BHA. You want them to maintain that vigilance, because you can be pretty sure if this is going on in Australia and possibly in America too, then someone will try something in this country.
Yeah, it doesn't sound altogether convincing, but let's have a look. You're on your way to Ascot. Yeah. Sprinter Sacre's the big attraction. For you, how do you feel about his chances this afternoon?
Oh, yeah, you'd love to see him win. He was a great champion when we last saw him sort of racing, up to April of 2 years ago. But I think you'd have to have the gravest reservations, wouldn't you, about whether or not he's going to be able to show anything like that level of form, having had the heart scare that caused him to be pulled up at Kempton Christmas before last. If there's a sort of comparable case in recent years, it would be Denman, and he ran to a very high level after he came back from his heart scare, which I gather was more significant than the one that Sprinter Sacre has been through. But Denman did only win once from 10 starts after his comeback, and I think you could probably say that he wasn't as good as he was before, given that when he won his Gold Cup just before his heart scare. That would be one of the most impressive performances by a steeplechaser of my lifetime. I think it might be the most impressive performance. So Sprinter Sacre is now 9. Even if he'd been completely healthy this whole time, he'd be kicking on a bit for a 2-mile chaser, wouldn't he? This race at Ascot today, since they made it a grade 1, no horse as old as 9 has won it in 7 runnings. So I tend to think as a punter, you'd want to be betting against him.
OK, brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, Chris. Thanks for bearing with us.
Sorry, I was a bit late on the phone.
No problem at all. And I'll see you at Ascot.